Hello, Dr. Noah Charney here. I'm delighted to give you this virtual talk. Believe it or not, I still have COVID, a very mild version, but I managed to lose my voice once and I'm very tired, so this might not be the most dynamic of the talk I've given, but I'm very happy to be here and support the team. And I'm going to talk to you today about forgery in the world of archaeological artifacts, and I'm going to focus on four of them. We've got the Shroud of Turin, the James Ossuary, the Piltdown Man's skull, and the Archaeoraptor fossil. I prepared a written talk so it would be easier to translate into Arabic. Normally I don't like to read my talks, but this is just, under the circumstances, probably going to be the easiest way forward. And I have this amazing green screen behind me. First time using new technology, a new camera and microphone and everything, so hopefully this works well. And thank you very much for your time and for inviting me to speak. Forgeries of objects of cultural or scientific interest tend to be examined one case study at a time, and extensive studies of many cases that seek to extrapolate theoretical superstructures based on the analysis of numerous cases, well, they're few. But juxtaposing selected case studies can shed light on trends in forgery, particularly motivations, methodologies, and even criminal profiles, all of which were the focus of my 2015 book, The Art of Forgery. And of course, I don't have an English copy with me. I have a Russian copy, maybe in the most popular edition at the moment, but anyway, this is what the cover looks like. And if you're interested in more, that's a book you might want to have a look at. This paper looks at a selection of famous forgeries of archaeological objects. And through them we'll consider how these artifacts were falsified for personal benefit, whether in terms of fame or finance. The Shroud of Turin was identified as a forgery as early as 1389, and yet the value in terms of income from pilgrims was such that it continued to be displayed and venerated. The James Ossuary was forged for profit and notoriety, to gain renown and then to sell. The Piltdown Man's skull was one of many alleged forgeries by a man who sought renown by finding the missing link that proved Darwinian theory of evolution from ape to Homo erectus. The same motivations drove the scientists who tried to pass off the Archaeoraptor fossil as a missing link that proved the relation between dinosaurs and birds. What links these four case studies is that each purported to provide in tangible form a missing link to a theory or religious belief. When a three-dimensional object fulfills the prophecy of a belief, it validates all those who maintained that belief without physical evidence proving it. For this reason, it is a wise target for forgers to create. In doing so, the belief in the existence and the desire to find such an object is pre-existing. There is no need to convince people who already fervently believe and wish to discover such an object. It is forging for the converted to alter the idiom. Let's begin with fake relics, the James Ossuary and the Shroud of Turin. The Middle Ages saw a lively trade in fake religious relics. There are so many pieces of the so-called true cross that one could build a small village, and there are enough leg bones of any one saint that one might think that they could perform in the circus. The rationale was simple. At the time, there was no way of knowing whether or not the bone or the cloth shards in question belonged to the saint with whom their affiliation was claimed. Couple that with the rabid demand for religious relics among believers who felt empowered in their faith by seeing tangible proof of it, whether in the form of miracles or physical remnants of holy men or women, and one had a ripe situation in which confidence men might flourish. The scale of the trade in relics, fake and ostensibly authentic, rose dramatically with the Crusades. Particularly the Fourth Crusade in 1204 saw the redistribution of religious relics from the sacked Christian city of Constantinople, with major objects including the Shroud of Turin and the Holy Lance, looted by Christian knights and brought back home with them to Western Europe. Because of this high-profile redistribution of relics from the Near East, it was no leap of imagination for pious Europeans of all backgrounds, incomes, and education levels to believe that an errant knight or foot soldier had acquired this or that relic while on crusade, and that these objects should then enter the market in Europe. In the pantheon of Catholic relics, there are few more renowned than the Shroud of Turin. a linen cloth thought to have been used to wrap the body of Christ as he was prepared for burial. The shroud is still a major tourist attraction, both secular and religious. And yet, as early as the 13th century, a bishop wrote to the Pope demanding that the Vatican declare the shroud a fake, though his rationale remains unknown. In the 20th century, the shroud was subjected to scientific analysis, a hugely rare event for a religious relic, and the 13th century bishop's suspicions were confirmed. It appears to have been painted, circa 1300, in order to look like an ancient relic. But that has not stopped tourists, pilgrims, and conspiracy theory novelists from stoking the flames of intrigue surrounding what is one of the most famous objects in the world. The cult of a miraculous cloth began around the same time as the bishop's suspicions were raised, the 13th century. The legend of the Veronica veil, a sudarium, literally a cloth for sweat, that Veronica was said to have proffered to Christ on his way to Calvary, does not appear in the Bible. The story goes that Christ wiped his sweaty, blood-stained brow with the cloth and handed it back to Veronica. But the cloth or veil miraculously retained an image of Christ's face upon it. It became one of the most important relics held at the Vatican and is worshipped there, although the public is not permitted to see it. The Veronica veil story was largely disseminated by the hugely popular group biography of saints called the Golden Legend, published in 1260. By the 13th century Archbishop of Genoa, Jacobus da Voragine, which was a best-selling book of the medieval Europe, the second best-selling book after the Bible, in fact. The Veronica veil story, as it was related in the Golden Legend, became part of the so-called Apocrypha, the stories that are not in the Bible, but that we associate integrally with the life of Christ, to the point where most people assume that the story is from the Bible. Jacobus himself ends his relation of the Veronica veil story with a caveat, quote, "And hitherto is the story called Apocryphum read. They that have read this, let them say and believe as it shall please them," unquote. The Shroud of Turin rises from the tradition, launched largely by the popularity of the Veronica veil, of an acheiropoetia, a spontaneously generated image, not made by human hand. In particular, the shroud is associated with the idea of a mandilion, a version of the Veronica veil story in which an ill king was sent the veil, or the mandilion, by Veronica and was miraculously cured. The shroud is a linen sheet of the sort that would wrap a body as it was prepared for burial. The sheet bears the imprint of a bearded man, arms folded across his groin. Most importantly, one can clearly see wounds in his wrists as if he had been crucified. However, it is far easier to see the form of a man's body in a photographic negative image of the shroud. In person, the details on the shroud are difficult to make out. The first record of the shroud came from Liéry in France during the 1350s, when the Lord of Savoy established a church dedicated to its veneration. It was said to have been brought to France from the Holy Land by a French knight, Geoffroy de Charney, who died at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. Yes, he has the same surname as I do. I doubt that we were related, but there you go. Pierre d'Arcis, the Bishop of Troyes, wrote to Pope Urban VI in Avignon in 1389, requesting that the shroud be declared a false relic. The bishop's rationale, Martin Kemp writes in his book Christ to Coke, was that his predecessor as Bishop of Troyes, Henri de Poitiers, quote, eventually, after diligent inquiry and examination, concluded that said cloth had been cunningly painted, the truth being attested by the artist who had painted it, to wit, that it was a work of human skill and not miraculously wrought or bestowed, unquote. The bishop's word was insufficient to quell the enthusiasm of the worshipping masses to see relics. The fact that there was an active trade in fake relics throughout the Middle Ages did not stop the hunger for worshippers to see tangible proof to support their beliefs. The shroud remained part of the House of Savoy and was a tourist attraction even into the 16th century, when it was moved to Turin in 1578 so that pilgrims could see it more easily. There it has remained. In 1958, the Vatican officially approved of the shroud as a legitimate means of Catholic devotion. Art historian Martin Kemp, who authenticated Leonardo's La Bella Principessa among many other works, offers an art historical analysis that does not support its authenticity. Kemp notes that the linen, had it been placed on a corpse, would have sunken around the body, molding to it. When the linen was stretched flat afterwards, impressions of the flanks of the body, the top of the head, and the soles of the feet would likely be seen, not just the front of the body. In the shroud, they are not visible. Further, the limbs of the corpse are stick-like, and even the fingers look more like Gothic painted anatomy rather than any real body. Kemp suggests that if asked to estimate the date of the shroud as an artwork, he would suggest late 13th, early 14th century. The art historical analysis matches the scientific studies. In 1988, the authorities in Turin did something extraordinary. They permitted the shroud to undergo scientific testing from 3 different international laboratories. Carbon dating from scientific labs placed the shroud circa 1300. University of Oxford, University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology all agreed that the shroud dated from sometime between 1260 and 1390 AD, with a 95% confidence in this date range, about as good as anyone could hope for with carbon dating. It appears that the shroud was created around 1300 in order to look like an ancient relic. A separate study in 1979 by renowned forensic scientist Walter McCrone suggested that the image of the body on the shroud was made up of microscopic pigment particles, and therefore that the image had been painted with hematite, an iron oxide, otherwise known as blood ore. The debate rages, as it will when objects of devotion clash with scientific studies, and when imagination and romanticism duel with empirical evidence. The forger surely succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, creating from scratch an object of devotion for millions over hundreds of years. The bottom line is that belief in relics such as the shroud is a choice that anyone is permitted to make, though so often we forget that the Church does not permit the worship of idols, and that any image or relic is meant as a devotional aid through which one is brought closer to God. The object itself must not be worshipped.